Start the class. We are going to start a new chapter, that is respiration in plants. In the last class we have completed the chapter called as photosynthesis, right? Now whenever we talk about respiration, first we need to know what is the content of this chapter. Chapter 2 we keep for him. Talking about respiration, what is the meaning of respiration is something that we know. Respiration means we take in oxygen and give out carbon dioxide. That process is called as respiration. But together with respiration we come across another word that is called as breathing, right? So breathing ki hoy? What is breathing? What do you do in breathing? In breathing also you do the same thing, you take in oxygen and you give out carbon dioxide. In respiration also you do the same thing, you take in oxygen and you give out carbon dioxide. But there is a difference between breathing and respiration. What is the difference? Breathing cannot?
We cannot get energy through breathing.
Actually the main point of difference is whenever we are talking about breathing requires a proper system. You have the nose, you have the nostrils, you have the lungs, the entire system is associated, that is called as breathing, and breathing is associated with only that part itself, right? Stomach aloke breathing no hoy, or lungs aloke breathing hoy. But if you are talking about respiration, we understand cellular respiration, which is something that occurs in each and every cell of the body. Right? So cell to bhitorot jinto exchange of gas hoy ase, oxygen loi ase, carbon dioxide ulai goi ase, and at that expense what we are preparing is energy. That is what is called as respiration, right? So breathing, respiration, we had an idea. Next is talking about respiration. Obviously it is broadly divided into two types, aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration, right? Aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration okuman ami already porhi ahisu, so we have an idea. So if the respiration process occurs in presence of oxygen, that is called as aerobic, and if respiration occurs in absence of oxygen, that is called as anaerobic. Now respiration in absence of oxygen mane ki? আমি তো এনে এতিয়ালৈকে কি ডিসকাস কৰিলো যে ৰেসপিৰেশন হ'ব লাগিলে আমি অক্সিজেন লও, কাৰ্বন ডাইঅক্সাইড উলাই দিও, no? First we need to know what exactly is respiration or what happens in respiration. Respiration is a process in which the food gets broken down, right? So respiration on oxygen loisu, carbon dioxide ulai disu, he je oxygen to amar bhitorot humale, he oxygen to ki koribo? It will reach each and every cell. What will the oxygen do inside the cell? Inside the cell, the oxygen will start finding out the food materials and start breaking it down. Oxidation reaction hobo. We don't use the word food materials, instead we will be using a word that is called as respiratory substrate. Right? So cell bilakor bhitorot ki thake? Respiratory substrate thake. Respiratory substrate in the form of ki? The most common type of food is obviously carbohydrates, no? Carbohydrates or glucose. In terms of plants also, photosynthesis ami porhi ahisu. So cells bilakor bhitorot already glucose to ase. So respiration jetia hobo cell to bhitorot, what would the oxygen do? The oxygen will break down the food there, right? So any type of respiratory substrate, common whole carbohydrate, I think you have come across certain conditions where people go for starving, but people go for dieting, kore no? Dieting jetia eta person e kore, tetia ki no kore? Khwa bostu he na khai? Respire kore ne no kore? Respire kore. So mo অলপ আগতে কি কইলো যে respire কৰিলে oxygen বিলাক কি হ'ব cellৰ ভিতৰত সোমাই যাব আৰু cellৰ ভিতৰত গৈ পেলাই what it will do, it will start breaking out the food. If you are not taking food, then what will the oxygen do? Oxygen to kiba so once it enters the cell, it has to do oxidation, hi kiba ta bhangiboi lagibo. So food in the form of carbohydrate nai jodi, it's okay. So if carbohydrate is present, easily target carbohydrate breakdown koribo, ATP produce koribo. Jedi khwa bostu khwa nai bahut din, tetia ki hobo? It will start breaking what? The fats that is present in your cell, right? He karone besi din na khale ki hoy, manu khinai jay, no? Khinai ki ho jay karon the fats started dissolving. One way of dissolving fat is the role of oxygen. Oxygen is cell to bhitorot carbohydrates poa nai, fats spices, so he started breaking down the fats. And in spite of that, tar pisoto fats started dissolving, fats komi goi ase, and in spite of that you are not taking food, you are continuing your dieting program, or maybe you are going for starvation. Ultimately ki hobo? Bahut din jodi tumi dietot thaka tetia ki hobo? Finish? The cell will collapse, right? Why? কিহৰ কাৰণে? কাৰণ অক্সিজেন to আমি লৈয়ে থাকো. It is not like this that at any time of the day that আমি অক্সিজেন নলওঁ আৰু তেনেকুৱাটো নহয়. So carbohydrates নাই, fats যিমানখিনি আছিলে চেলটোৰ ভিতৰত, that got over. What next? It will start breaking the protein, right? Once it starts breaking the protein, and we know protein is supposed to be called as the building block of a cell. So building block to jodi bhangi jay, cell to no kopra thakibo. right? So ultimately we know what is respiration. It is a process to which the food materials or respiratory substrate present inside a cell gets broken down in presence of oxygen or in absence of oxygen. So খোৱা বস্তু ভাঙি যাব, অক্সিজেন লৈ ভাঙিব নহলে অক্সিজেন নলৈ ভাঙিব। যদি অক্সিজেন লৈ পেলাই ভাঙে তেতিয়াহলে তাক আমি কি বুলি কম? aerobic respiration. If the respiratory substrate breaks down in absence of oxygen, তাক আমি কি বুলি কম? anaerobic respiration. Now, together with aerobic and anaerobic, we come across a term that is called as fermentation, right? What is fermentation? Fermentation is exactly anaerobic respiration. So, fermentation or ki hoy? Respiratory substrate, but we don't use the word respiratory substrate. Food to ki hobo, ebar breakdown hobo in absence of oxygen, right? Anaerobic or ki hasile? In absence of oxygen. Fermentation or ki hoise? In absence of oxygen. Again, there is a difference. What is the difference? Anaerobic respiration taking place outside the body is called as fermentation. যদি সেলটোৰ ভিতৰত হয় তাক আমি কি বুলি কম? anaerobic respiration কম। Exactly the same process যদি outside the body তুমি ইন্ডাষ্ট্ৰিত কৰি আছা বা কিবা প্ৰডাক্টত কৰি আছা, fermentation, for example তুমি ৰাইচ বহুত দিন ঘৰত থৈ দিছা, পইতা ভাত যোনটো আমি কওঁ ন, থৈ দিলা তাত কি হ'ব? fermentation হৈ যায় ন। actually তাত কি হৈ আছে? anaerobic respiration এটো হৈ আছে। ultimately কি produce কৰিছে? bubbles produce কৰে নকৰে? দেখিছা নাই ক'ব নোৱাৰো। পইতা ভাত থৈ দিয়া, or maybe if you keep dough ন, কেক চেক বনোৱাৰ পিছত তুমি ডোটো যদি অলপ দেৰিলৈকে থৈ দিয়া, অলপ পিছত কি হ'ব? তাত bubbles ওলাব ন। so these are nothing but products of fermentation. What is fermentation? I mean details to obviously korime. As of now, anaerobic and fermentation or difference to I think we can have a simple idea. Jedi cell or bhitor hoy ase, that is called as anaerobic. Jedi outside the body hoy ase, exact the same process tak ami ki boli kom? Fermentation. Clear? Next. Next is, okay, coming to respiration. The next question is, why do we respire? We respire to get energy. Right? So what happens in respiration? The food gets broken down. Who breaks the food? Oxygen breaks the food. Our oxygen break korute eta food by eta carbohydrate by eta respiratory substrate. In various steps it keeps on breaking down, and ultimately at each and every step they will be producing certain amount of energy in the form of ki? In the form of ATP. Energy hoday ki form of? Obviously in the form of ATP. So ami respire kiho karone koru? Jate niki ATP produce hoy. ATP code produce hoy? Obviously inside the cell. Inside the cell boli kole to no hobo, you have to be precise, because we know in a cell there are various cell organelles also. So ATP exactly code produce hobo. So we come across a word or maybe a line that is called as the powerhouse of a cell. Hetu to ami janu no. So if you talk about the powerhouse of a cell, then that is K, mitochondria. So we have a cell, right? Cellot ki ase? Food ase. Food to break down koribo. Suppose we are talking about food. Food to kune break down koribo? Jinto oxygen hobo. E gute process to tahade ki form koribo? ATP, right? ATP code form hobo. Eta common formation is obviously in mitochondria, right? Aru kisuman ATP in the cytoplasm also will get produced. Karon food to code asile, food to mitochondria bhitorot nasile, food code asile yate, right? Food breakdown hobo various steps of, ultimately ATP produce hobo, ATP code produce hobo in two places, cytoplasm aru mitochondria. Clear? Okay. Next, coming to breaking of food, no? Breaking of food boli kole jihetu we have talked about the most common type of respiratory substrate, that is glucose. So we have a process that is called as glycolysis. Respiration or kisuman steps ase. Key steps? The first step is called as glycolysis. Lysis mane ki? Breakdown. So glucose molecule will get broken down with the help of various agents, no? Various enzymes, various factors. Bahut bilak bostu loi pelai ki hobo? Cellor bhitor jintu glucose asile, he glucose to bhangibo, and glucose breaks down into what? At a 10-step reaction hoy, and ultimately what they will produce is pyruvic acid. So question kene kya hai? The pyruvic acid kune form korile? Glucose. One molecule of glucose breaks down to form how many molecules of pyruvic acid? 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Second question is, pyruvic acid coat form hoise obviously in the coat. Food coat asile cytoplasm, to pyruvic acid coat form hoise in the cytoplasm itself. Etia glycolysis is a 10-step process. Within the steps, during certain steps, that ki hobo? ATP production hobo. কিন্তু গ্লাইকোলাইসিছত যিমানখিনি ATP produce হয় that is not sufficient to run the entire cell, and plus glycolysisot glucose getting converted in pyruvic acid could not be considered as complete oxidation of food. Respiration পঢ়িলে আমি দুটা words পাম, এটা হল complete oxidation, এটা হল incomplete oxidation. Simple meaning অত কি যে complete oxidation আমি কেতিয়া কম যেতিয়া এটা ফুড ভাঙি পেলাই তিনটা বস্তু produce কৰে, কি কি কার্বন ডাই অক্সাইড, ATP and water. যদি এই গোটেই তিনটা বস্তু produce হয় তেতিয়াহলে আমি তাক কি বুলি কম complete oxidation. এই তিনটাৰ ভিতৰত যদি কিবা এটা produce নহয় তেতিয়াহলে তাক আমি কি কম incomplete oxidation. Normally aerobic respiration is an example of কি complete oxidation, anaerobic respiration is an example of কি incomplete oxidation, right? So complete oxidation হ'ব লাগিলে food to break down কৰিব লাগিব, food to break down কৰি পেলাই কি produce কৰিব লাগিব carbon dioxide, water and ATP. As far as carbon dioxide, water and ATP is concerned, questions ahe exactly tahator place of origin ba place of formation ki. If you are talking about ATP, we have already said ATP code form koribo, kisman cytoplasm ot form koribo, kisman kihot form koribo inside the mitochondria. So ATP we have an idea. Aru baki ki thakile carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide code form koribo aru ATP code form water code form koribo, hekhini bostu ami pohim, right? So up till now what I have said is when we talk about respiration, respiration out ki hoy glucose bhangi jay ki hole pyruvic acid hole, right? So pyruvic acid a process to ki boli kom ami glycolysis. Respiration is completed by 3 steps. First step to ki glycolysis. Glycolysis hot jinto pyruvic acid form kore, a pyruvic acid formation or homoid ami ki dekhibo lagisile ATP দেখিব লাগিছিলে, water দেখিব লাগিছিলে আৰু CO2 যদি গুটেইকিটা দেখিলো হেতেন এইখিনিতে প্ৰসেসটো কমপ্লিট হৈ গল হয়, কিন্তু we will not see the formation of the entire things. ATP is something যে প্ৰত্যেকটো স্টেপতে আমি অকমান ATP formation দেখাই পাম, ঠিক আছে, কিন্তু water code form হ'ব, carbon dioxide code form হ'ব, we'll see it later. So first step glycolysis ekhinte complete নহয়, pyruvic acid needs to get further broken down. So ebar ki hobo pyruvic acid broken down koribo ki hole acetyl coenzyme A, right? So acetyl coenzyme A to ultimately ki koribo oxaloacetic acid accept kori pelai eta cycle solabo. This is called as Krebs cycle, right? So first step ki glycolysis, glycolysis followed by the second step ki Krebs cycle, right? Krebs cycle hoi joar pisot aru eta step ase that is called as terminal oxidation. So respiration consists of 3 steps, that is glycolysis, Krebs cycle and terminal oxidation. After the completion of these 3 steps only, we see the evolution of or the formation of these 3 products, and then we can use the word called as complete oxidation, right? So etia kotha to hol pyruvic acid ki kolu acetyl coenzyme A le convert hol, ami ekhini details পঢ়িব লাগিব যে glycolysis code hoise, right? Glycolysis or jiman kita reactions ase e gutei 10 step reaction kini ami steps kita পঢ়িব লাগিব. প্ৰত্যেকটো স্টেপত কি হয় স্পেসিফিক কিছুমান এনজাইমস ইনভলভ হৈ আছে যোনটো কি এটা বস্তু আন বস্তুলৈ কনভাৰ্ট কৰি দিয়ে. সো আউট অফ দিস 10 এনজাইমস স্পেসিফিকলি 4টা এনজাইমৰ ওপৰত বিৰাট কোৱেশ্চন আহিছে, সো উইল বি টকিং এবাউট দ্যাট, ৰাইট? সো পাইৰুভিক এসিডৰ পিছত এই পোৰ্শনটোক we have a term that is called as link reaction. Link reaction or pisothe ami ki dekha pao Krebs cycle. So first step or second step or major junto phase june link kore tak ami ki boli kom link reaction. Link reaction ot ki produce hoy acetyl coenzyme kune produce kore pyruvic acid আর কিয় produce করে. So আমি কি কৈ আছো যে গ্লুকোজ মলিকিউল to পুরা ভাঙি পেলাই ইমানখিনি বস্তু produce কৰিব লাগিব, right? এইখিনি লকে we will see that it is only ATP that is formed and with one molecule of water মাত্ৰ এটা molecule form কৰে. যেহেতু এটা molecule of water form কৰে in glycolysis, যদি question to আহে where is water synthesized during respiration, you cannot be giving credit to glycolysis. কাৰণ ইফ ইউ হেভ নোটিছ আমি যেবাৰে অক্সিজেন লওঁ কাৰ্বন ডাই অক্সাইড ইনহেল আউট কৰোঁ ন বা এক্সহেল কৰোঁ তেতিয়া কি হ'ব হাতত পানী লাগে নালাগে পানী লাগে মানে কি ৱাটাৰ ফৰ্ম হৈছে ইজ ইট অনলি ওৱান ড্ৰপ অফ ৱাটাৰ দ্যাট ইজ ফৰ্ম নে অনবৰত ফৰ্ম কৰিয়ে আছে অনবৰত কৰি আছে সেইকাৰণেতো নাকেৰে যেতিয়া তুমি উশাহটো বাহিৰত ওলোৱা ৱেট ফিল হয় ৰাইট চ' গ্লাইকলাইচিছ প্ৰচেছটোত গ্লুক'জ যেতিয়া পাইৰুভিক এচিডলৈ ভাঙিব তেতিয়া মাত্ৰ এটা ষ্টেপত এটা মলিকুল অফ ৱাটাৰ প্ৰডিউচ হয় ঠিক আছে সেইকাৰণে আমি ইয়াতে ক্ৰেডিট নিদিওঁ চ' আল্টিমেটলি গ্লাইকলাইচিছত কি প্ৰডিউচ হ'ল আউট অফ দ্য থ্ৰী থিংছ ইটছ অনলি ATP that got produced what is left behind water and carbon dioxide because of that pyruvic acid needs to get further broken down clear next question second step ki Krebs cycle question ahe Krebs cycle kot hoy ami eta cellor kotha koi asu cellot tumar food asile food to if suppose we are talking about a cell like this no yate carbohydrate asile ba glucose to ki hole convert hoy gol pyruvic acid right yate ultimately ki form korile ATP form korile tar pisot ki koiso je pyruvic acid yar next step to ki Krebs cycle kot hoy Krebs cycle hoday mitochondria bhitorot hoy right whenever we talk about a cell organelle I think you remember we have used a term called as lumen or matrix of mitochondria right so mitochondria bhitorot ki hobo Krebs cycle hobo pyruvic acid code form korise cytoplasmot pyruvic acid bhangi pelai ultimately it has to get linked so e ki hole convert koribo acetyl coenzyme code form koribo perimitochondrial space mitochondria double membrane right duita membrane or majot space ase he space khinik ami ki boli kom perimitochondrial space pyruvic acid code form korise cytoplasmor pora pyruvic acid e ki continue koribo lagibo Krebs cycle hobo lagibo pyruvic acid aru bhangibo lagibo keneke bhangibo by the process of Krebs cycle hobo lagile pyruvic acid mitochondria bhitorle khumai jabo lagibo but mitochondrial membrane is impermeable to pyruvic acid ok teneke humabole nidie it has to get broken down right so it breaks down into acetyl coenzyme A enters inside the matrix of mitochondria আর যেতিয়া acetyl coenzyme A corpora membrane or pora bhitorle humale no kunubai to tak accept koribo leibo so we have a term called as a acceptor molecule that is oxaloacetic acid citric acid cycle ba Krebs cycle it is the same thing যেতিয়া citric acid cycle আৰম্ভ হয় what is the first molecule that starts the entire process it is always oxaloacetic acid mitochondria ভিতৰত কি আছে oxaloacetic acid or পৰাই কি হয় Krebs cycle to আৰম্ভ হয় right oxaloacetic acid এ Krebs cycle কেতিয়া আৰম্ভ কৰিব যেতিয়া হি acetyl coenzyme accept কৰিব acetyl coenzyme কোপৰা ফৰ্ম কৰিলে pyruvic acid to ভাঙি পেলাই acetyl coenzyme ফৰ্ম কৰিলে right pyruvic acid ko perform korile glucose bhangi gol kune bhangile oxygen ne bhangile right kintu we will study later out of these three steps no eta sentence ami yate use koru je glycolysis is independent of oxygen mane ki glycolysis oxygen er eko role nai ঠিক আছে তোমার সেলটোৰ ভিতৰত অক্সিজেন থাকক বা অক্সিজেন না থাকক গ্লাইকোলাইসিস গ্লুকোজ গেটিং কনভার্টেড টু পাইরুভিক অ্যাসিড হে প্রসেসটো হবই পাইরুভিক অ্যাসিডে যেতিয়া কনভার্ট হব নেক্সট স্টেপত অক্সিজেন লব নে অক্সিজেন নলয় so it has two options either it can take in oxygen or it cannot take in oxygen যদি if it takes in oxygen হে গুটে প্রসেসটো আমি কি বলি কম aerobic respiration যদি পাইরুভিক অ্যাসিডে অক্সিজেন নলয় পেলাই ভাঙি যায় তেল তাক আমি কি বলি কম anaerobic respiration মই এখন চার্ট দি দিম এই চার্টখন বেশি ক্লিয়ার হ'ব as of now just to have an idea so what we have said is inside the cell glucose ase glucose ki hole convert হৈ যাব pyruvic acid needs to get further broken down and it has to undergo Krebs cycle code হৈ আছে matrix of mitochondria তাহাৰক এটা link reaction লাগিব acetyl coenzyme তাৰ পিছত ইয়াতে কি ফৰ্ম কৰিব Krebs cycle এটা যেতে Krebs cycle হ'ব Krebs cycle or to products form কৰিব যেনেকে glycolysis হলে অকল কি produce কৰিছিল ATP তো Krebs cycle যেতিয়া run কৰিব তেতিয়া কি produce কৰিব when Krebs cycle is when Krebs cycle occurs ATP to obviously produce koribo. ATP kyo produce koribo? Karan protective step ote okoman energy produce kore. Tinta step ase no? Glycolysis to ATP produce hoy, Krebs cycle to ATP produce hoy, terminal oxidation to ATP produce hoy, right? So Krebs cycle major credit to ami code diu evolution of carbon dioxide. Tinta bostu ase ATP code produce hoy, generally mitochondria koi thoi diu glycolysis cytoplasm ji kwa, right? Carbon dioxide code form koribo. Carbon dioxide is the result of Krebs cycle. Duta hoi gol, what is left behind is water. Water is a result of ki terminal oxidation. Terminal oxidation ki hoy je electrons bilak eta jagar pra antu jagale transfer hoy aru in the process tahate ATP produce kore. Keneke produce kore, we'll be talking about it later, right? So
Glycolysis এতিয়া হয় যাতে পাইৰুভিক এসিডৰ লৈকে যেতিয়া কনভার্ট হয় গ্লুকোজ তেতিয়া অক্সিজেন নালাগে
Glycolysis jetia hobo, glucose to jetia pyruvic acid ole bhangibo, tetia hole various enzymes would be responsible and not oxygen. You don't have any role of oxygen in this first step, right? Pyruvic acid jeti Krebs cycle ot jay, tetia he oxygen lole he Krebs cycle ot jabo. Pyruvic acid e jeti oxygen nulua ke bhangi jay, tetia hole Krebs cycle nohoy. Krebs cycle hole ki hobo? Aerobic respiration hoy jabo. Pyruvic acid e oxygen nulua ke jedi bhange tetia hole anaerobic respiration hobo. Aru anaerobic respiration ot jeneke aerobic respiration or product ki ATP, water and carbon dioxide. Anaerobic respiration or to product thakibo. Generally what? Alcohol. Depending on which type of fermentation we are talking about, lactic acid fermentation ase, butyric acid fermentation ase, alcoholic fermentation ase, depending on that products bilak tahator alcohol bilak beleg hobo, right? So ultimately etu independent. Pyruvic acid is jedi oxygen loy Krebs cycle hobo, pyruvic acid is jedi oxygen noloy anaerobic respiration hobo. Ar jedi anaerobic respiration hoy tahate alcohol ba lactic acid depending on that coat hoise kuntu cellot hoise hetur upor depend kori products bilak form koribo, right? In normal cases amar tat ki hoy obviously aerobic respiration. So ami aerobic respiration we respire aerobically he karone amar body bitorot ki form koribo, ATP form koribo, carbon dioxide form koribo aru water form koribo. But there is a special cell that is we have to give credit to, or we have to mention the muscle cell. Muscle cellot ki hoy anaerobic condition o hoy aru jetia anaerobic condition hoy tetia ki hobo? Cramp hoy no, cramp or kyo karon lactic acid form kore, right? So ekini ami as we go on will be understanding. So this is the content. Apart from that, eta word already use korilu, that is respiratory substrate, right? Aru eta bostu use korim, that is respiratory quotient, right? Ekini ami pisot korim. So we'll just start. Okoman ini just lump sum ke idea eta paisu code ki hoise bostu no. Aru yate ami steps bilak mukhosto koribo libo. You have to by heart Krebs cycle, you have to by heart glycolysis. Karon steps or pra question ahibo, right? Ar kun kita steps or besi important no, jiman MCQs koriba himan you will have an idea, right? Krebs cycle ot keita step thake 8 ta, glycolysis ot keita thake 10 ta, right? No doubt we'll be studying all of them, kintu question ahar chances kisuman steps ot besi. So jeti ami MCQs korim, we'll have an idea. Amar classor koi diminiu. Okay, it is just introduction kini likhu aji. Okay, atar agote aru eta kotha, if you are talking about respiration, we respire to produce energy. What happens in respiration? The glucose gets broken down. The glucose molecule gets broken down to produce ATP. Eta glucose bhangile keita ATP produce hoy? Eta glucose to bhangile ki hobo? ATP to produce hobo no? So ATP confusion ase no, kisuman books of 36, kisuman 38, right? 36, 38. Actually confusion no hoy, depending on which cell we are talking about. Kisuman cellot jedi aerobic respiration hoise tetel 36 ATP produce hobo. Kisuman cell of the body jedi aerobic respiration hoise tetel 38 ATP produce hobo, right? Why is the difference? Ako pisot ami korim. Electron shuttle boli bostu eta ase. Okay, so we'll start with the notes. হা কোনটো GH ইয়া Introduction type. Now talking about respiration, respiration in a broader sense কি হয় এটা reaction, photosynthesis কি আসলে এটা reaction, যেটি আমি reaction বলি কওঁ, there are certain terms that follows, মনত আছেনে? Oxidative reaction, reductive reaction, anabolic reaction, catabolic reaction, endergonic reaction, exergonic reaction. আমি photosynthesis এই টার্মসগুলো অলরেডি কৈ থৈছিলোঁ, ৰাইট? ইফ ইউ আৰ টকিং এবাউট ৰেস্পিৰেশ্যন, ৰেস্পিৰেশ্যনক আমি কোনকেইটা ৱৰ্ডছ দি ডিছক্ৰাইব কৰিম? ফাৰ্ষ্ট অক্সিডেটিভ নে ৰিডাক্টিভ? অক্সিডেটিভ, অক্সিজেন দি ভাঙি যায়, ৰাইট? নেক্সট এনাবলিক নে কেটাবলিক? ব্ৰেকডাউন হ'লে কেটাবলিক, ফটোচিনথেসিছত ফুড প্ৰডিউচ হৈছে সেইকাৰণে কি হৈছিলে? এনাবলিক। নেক্সট এণ্ডাৰগনিক নে এক্সাৰগনিক? এণ্ডাৰগনিক আৰু এক্সাৰগনিক কিহৰ ওপৰত ডিপেণ্ড কৰিছিলে? সিনথেসিস অফ কি? ATP, ৰাইট? এণ্ডাৰগনিক যদি ATP ইউজ হয় তেতিয়াহ'লে তাক আমি এণ্ডাৰগনিক, যদি ATP প্ৰডিউচ হয় তেতিয়াহ'লে তাক আমি কি বুলি কওঁ? এক্সাৰগনিক। লিখি লোৱা। Anaerobic respiration কোনে ডিসকভার করেছে? এইটোৰ ওপৰত কোৱেশ্চন আহিছে। Respiration is a reaction. What type of a reaction? Catabolic, exergonic, oxidative? It is also called as dark respiration. Why is it called as dark respiration? Maybe because it does not have any relation with the day and the night factor. Right? Respire on about kori thaku. It's called as a dark reaction. Internal respiration because it's something that occurs inside the cell. Right? And as far as representation is concerned, it is represented by this formula. Photosynthesis to ami eta likhisilu na the equation. So representation kihere kore etu ami sabo lagibo. Thik ase yate ki hoise food is getting with the help of oxygen gets broken down, and ultimately what they produce is carbon dioxide to produce koribo, water produce koribo, energy produce koribo. Energy in the form of ki ATP. ATP boli koi thoi diu, kintu ATP if you want to convert, because energy unit ki joules no. If this is over, types of respiration likhe bas.
Respiration, internal respiration, but fermentation, like you say that it is external.
Fermentation is an external process, mane extracellular process. It does not occur inside the cell. Fermentation is just a word that is used for anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration or jikhini reaction hoy no, exactly eketai bostu. Kintu body er jodi bahirot hoy, fermentation is a word that we use, but it's the same thing.
Respiration, one of the type is anaerobic.
Respiration, one of the type is anaerobic. Anaerobic respiration occurs inside the cell.
But in case of fermentation,
if anaerobic respiration occurs outside the body, it is called as fermentation, right? It a muscle cell or hamar ki hoy, anaerobic respiration hoy. So at that time you cannot be saying that the muscle cell is undergoing fermentation. Teneka no hoy. It's anaerobic respiration itself is going, because cell or bhitor hoise, right? Next, like types of respiration. On the basis of respiratory substrate, generally ami jetia kau no, types of respiration, we generally use two terms, aerobic and anaerobic, but that classification is on the basis of what? On the basis of availability of oxygen. A2 classification ki on the basis of the respiratory substrate. Respiratory substrate boli kole ki bujo? The food that will get broken down, right? constituents. Okay, coming to this one, floating respiration and protoplasmic respiration. Question has been asked about protoplasmic. Question 2 keneke ahise, what is the respiration of starved cells called as? Respiration of starved cells mane ki jetia cell to bosot khwa bostu na thakibo no, jetia leke khwa bostu thake, the oxygen will break down the common respiratory substrate, and that type of a respiration would be called as floating. When the food is not available, then ultimately the basic components will start getting breaking down, right, and at that time it's called as protoplasmic. So a word to mono rakhiba, right. Next is on the basis of availability of oxygen, aerobic or anaerobic. Aerobic respiration denoted by this one. Aerobic respiration hobo lagile ki hobo lagibo, certain types of enzymes, and where will it take place? It will take place in the cytoplasm and also in the mitochondria. Next likhiba anaerobic respiration. Complete oxidation, incomplete oxidation words kita mone rakhiba. Complete oxidation mane ki aerobic respiration, incomplete oxidation mane ki anaerobic respiration. Why is it called as incomplete? Because all the three products are not produced. Carbon dioxide, water aru ATP no gutei kita produce nohoy. Kotsev, Kostytchev, Russian. Okay, ইয়াতে চাবাচোন হা পইণ্ট কিছুমান কম্পেৰেটিভ পইণ্ট ফাৰ্ষ্টটো আমি কি পালোঁ কমপ্লিট ইনকমপ্লিট এই দুটা টাৰ্ম ছেকেণ্ড ইজ অকাৰ্ছ ইন এৰবিক ৰেছপিৰেশ্যন অকাৰ্ছ ইন এণ্ড মাইটকণ্ড্ৰিয়া বৰ্ডটো মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব এনএৰবিক ৰেছপিৰেশ্যন অকাৰ্ছ অনলি ইন দ্য চাইটোপ্লাজম মাইটকণ্ড্ৰিয়াত প্ৰডিউচ নহয় ঠিক আছে প্ৰচেছটো নাযায় নেক্সট In case of aerobic respiration, eta glucose bhangile kiman ATP produce hobo 36 or 38. In case of anaerobic respiration, kiman produce hobo just 2, right? Similarly, if the question is asked fermentation or kiman ATP produce hobo, since it's anaerobic respiration itself, answer ki hobo 2, right? Okay. Aru ki produce koribo alcohol, ethyl alcohol. So anaerobic respiration or ekhiniye information. What is important is who discovered pasture, right? Next is number of ATP that is produced to cytoplasm, right? Next is anaerobic respiration inside the muscle cells. Title tat ki produce koribo lactic acid. Anaerobic respiration could be seen in certain types of plants also. Normally, generally, ami plants bilakor kotha kole anaerobically to tahate GI thakibo nware na plants bilak. But there are certain stages where it might occur. I think we have seen one example, no? Seeds bilak ami jete kini anu no, kini ani pelai ami sow korar agote. If you have seen, it is soaked in water for one night. Seeds, living and non-living. Living. So living took jeti tu pani tolot humai thoi dia. তেতিয়ালে কি হ'ব লাগিছিল মৰি যাব লাগিছিল কাৰণ ইউ কাট অফ দ্য অক্সিজেন দেন অবভিয়াছলি এনাৰবিক কণ্ডিশ্যনত হি মৰি যাব লাগিছিল মৰি যায় নেকি নাযায় সো দ্যাট ইজ what is called as anaerobiosis, right? So কেতিয়াবা seeds are due to certain conditions কি হয় for a particular amount of time anaerobically তাহাতে থাকিব পাৰে, right? One example is the soaking of the seeds overnight before sowing, right? On details নালাগে এখিনি হলে হল. So ultimately, we have just written the introduction part of respiration. What is respiration? Certain names of scientists, then types of respiration, floating, protoplasmic, aerobic, anaerobic, right? Anaerobic, aerobic respiration details koribo laibo, and since fermentation is also something that we have to learn, I mean first fermentation kini korilom, right? The heading koriba fermentation. Fermentation complete korar pisot ami aerobic respiration details arambho korim. What is fermentation? Anaerobic respiration outside the cell or the body is called as fermentation, right? Next, various types of fermentations are there. Kintu tumalkor course of matter duta fermentation lage, eta hol alcoholic aru eta hol lactic acid. So what happens in alcoholic and what happens in lactic acid? Let me give you some. So what is for fermentation? Anaerobic respiration. It is the extracellular process. As far as mechanism is concerned, fermentation or to ki hoy food to break down e hoi jay, right? Kintu it occurs in two steps. The first step, glycolysis, and if you have noticed, glycolysis is something that is common for both aerobic and anaerobic, right? Aerobic e hok ba anaerobic e nohok, first step to glycolysis hotai hobo lagibo, right? So it is independent of oxygen, and after glycolysis ki form koribo pyruvic acid. So the second step is breakdown of pyruvic acid. Eta glycolysis to ami details of koribo lagibo, jehetu kora nai, eta just ekdom lump sum ke kiba eta likhi thoi dim, and later we'll do in details, right? So glycolysis boli likha, tamane the first step. Okay. Glycolysis, or what we know up till now, is the breaking down of a glucose molecule into pyruvic acid. Together in this process, pyruvic acid to form koribo, kintu ki release hobo, some amount of ATP will also get released. So we have seen the formation of ATP, and together with ATP, aru eta bostu dekhiso NADH2. Remember, we have talked about NADPH2 during photosynthesis, right? So NADH2 hok, NADPH2 hok, FADH2 hok, eblak ki hoy, these are reducing factors. In short, what we know, these are electron donors, right? Tahate electrons bilak donate kore. And why are we talking about electrons at this point of time? Remember, we have talked about chemiosmotic hypothesis, right? ATP formation koribo lagile role of electrons protons to thakiboi lagibo. So jehetu respiration of ATP produce koribo, so ATP jehetu produce koribo, teta to electrons protons or eta role thakiboi. So hey, electrons protons factor to ami kopra pam reducing cofactor bilakor pora, right? So ki dhoroner khali a question to ahe NADH2 code produce kore, NADPH2 code produce kore. Jete P thakibo no, we understand that it's something related with photosynthesis. So NADPH2 always produced during light reaction, no, photosynthesis. NADH2 or FADH2 during respiration, right? What will happen to the reducing factors? All of pisot. Etu jedi hol, next likha types of fermentation. Glycolysis code hoise, aapko eitu point cytoplasm. Aerobic respiration code hoy cytoplasm aru mitochondria. Aerobic respiration of first step ki glycolysis coat hoy only cytoplasm, right? এইখিনি হ'ল নেকি চোৱাচোন ফাৰ্ষ্ট alcoholic formation হ'ল ন ইয়াতে ফাৰ্ষ্ট এটা লাইন মনত ৰাখিবা ইট ইজ দ্য most common type next লিখা it occurs in 2 steps or completes in 2 steps. Pyruvic acid or formula, ethyl alcohol or formula, like from botany point of view, you don't have to do, right? Kali khudibo pare je alcoholic fermentation completes itself into how many steps? 2 steps. Directly, food does, or pyruvic acid does not get broken down into alcohol. Majote eta intermediate product form kore no, acetaldehyde, right? So he karone 2 steps. Glucose কি ফর্ম কৰিলে pyruvic acid, কাৰণ আমি why have we started it from pyruvic acid only, because we know that glucose into pyruvic acid is common for both aerobic and anaerobic, right? It is after pyruvic acid that either it will be aerobic or it will be anaerobic, no? Pyruvic acid ইয়াতে কি কৰিছে, pyruvic acid did not take in oxygen, so obviously that aerobic respiration নহয়. So pyruvic acid কি হলে কনভার্ট হৈছে acetaldehyde, first step. Acetaldehyde কি হলে কনভার্ট হৈছে ethyl alcohol. So দুটা স্টেপত কমপ্লিট হৈছে, ইন্টারমিডিয়েট প্রোডাক্ট কি acetaldehyde, হে পইণ্টটো মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব। সেকেন্ড আৰু এটা কোৱেশ্চন কি আহে, চোৱা যিহেতু তোমালোকে দুটা ফাৰ্মেন্টেশন পঢ়িব লাগে ন, এলকহলিক পঢ়িব লাগে আৰু লেক্টিক এসিড পঢ়িব লাগে। ওয়ান বেসিক ডিফাৰেন্স, এটাত কি ফৰ্ম কৰিব, ইথাইল এলকহল ফৰ্ম কৰিব, এটাত কি ফৰ্ম কৰিব, লেক্টিক এসিড ফৰ্ম কৰিব, লেক্টিক এসিড ফাৰ্মেন্টেশনত। ওয়ান বেসিক ডিফাৰেন্স ইজ ইভলিউশন অফ কার্বন ডাইঅক্সাইড। ইয়াতে আমি কি ইউজ কৰিছো দোস্ত, ডিকাৰ্বক্সিলেজ হলে তো অবভিয়াসলি কার্বন ডাইঅক্সাইড ওলাব। সো কোৱেশ্চনটো কেনেকৈ আহে যে কার্বন ডাইঅক্সাইড যোনটো ফাৰ্মেন্টেশনত ওলাই, সেই ফাৰ্মেন্টেশনটোক আমি কি বুলি কওঁ, ল্যাকটিক এসিড ফাৰ্মেন্টেশন নে এলকহলিক? সো ইট ইজ অনলি ইন এলকহলিক ফাৰ্মেন্টেশন দ্যাট কার্বন ডাইঅক্সাইড gets evolved. আৰু কেতিয়াবা কোৱেশ্চনটো কি দিব পাৰে যে সাপোজ, সেইটো কোৱেশ্চন মই পিছত প্ৰেক্টিছ কৰাই দিম, এতিয়া নালাগে। সাপোজ উই হ্যাভ গ্লুকোজ টু pyruvic acid প্লাছ অক্সিজেন minus oxygen, right? Plus oxygen to আমি জানো যে এটো Krebs cycle হবো etc etc. Minus oxygen to fermentation হবো পারে। Fermentation দুটা fermentation পঢ়িব লাগিব A আৰু B, হা এনেকে কোৱেশ্চন থাকিব। ইয়াতে প্লাস CO2 থাকিব, ইয়াতে minus CO2 থাকিব। তাৰ মানে what does this indicate? This is a fermentation process where carbon dioxide is evolved. This is a fermentation process where carbon dioxide is not evolved. So যোনটোত carbon dioxide evolve হয় তাক আমি কি বুলি কম, alcoholic fermentation. So এই স্টেপটো আমি we have to pay interest যে carbon dioxide ক'ত evolve হৈছে। It's only in alcoholic fermentation যে carbon dioxide evolve হৈছে, lactic acid fermentationত carbon dioxide evolve নহয়। Clear? So এতিয়া যেহেতু কৰা নাই, আমি কোৱেশ্চনছ কৰিলে ক্লিয়াৰ হ'ম, কিন্তু এট দিছ মোমেণ্ট ইটসেল্ফ কোনটো পইণ্টত ষ্ট্ৰেছ দিব লাগে সেইটো বস্তু মনত ৰাখিবা। নেক্সট আৰু এটা কথা চোৱা, ইন কেছ অফ ৰেস্পিৰেশ্যন আমি কি কৈছিলোঁ যে 3 প্ৰডাক্টছ আৰ চিন্থেচাইজ, দ্যাট ইজ কাৰ্বন ডাইঅক্সাইড, ৱাটাৰ এণ্ড ATP, ৰাইট? ATP প্ৰডাকশ্যন হ'ব লাগিলে কি লাগিব আমাক, ৰিডিউসিং ফ্যাক্টৰ লাগিব, NADH2 লাগিব, FADH2 লাগিব। সো আলটিমেটলি ইন আদাৰ ৱে ৰাউণ্ড what we can say, NADH2 কাম কি, প্ৰডাকশ্যন অফ ATP। NADH2 কি দিব, ইলেক্ট্ৰনছ প্ৰটনছ দিব ন। ইলেক্ট্ৰনছ প্ৰটনছখিনি কিহৰ কাৰণে লাগে, ATP প্ৰডাকশ্যনৰ কাৰণে লাগে। সো আমি এনেকৈ ক'ব নোৱাৰোঁ নেকি NADH2 কিহৰ কাৰণে লাগে, ATP প্ৰডাকশ্যনৰ কাৰণে লাগে, right? So আৰু এটা বস্তু ইয়াতে হল, যেহেতু আমি গ্লাইকোলাইসিস কৰা নাই এতিয়া, সেইকাৰণে we are getting a little bit confused. Once we are completed with the entire chapter, এইখিনি আৰু ইজি হৈ যাব, right? প্ৰথমতে গ্লাইকোলাইসিস কৰিব লাগিছিল, তাৰপিছত ফাৰ্মেন্টেশন কৰিব লাগিছিল, কিন্তু যেহেতু anaerobic respiration আমি কৰিছোৱে, so that's the reason why in the form of a note I have given it like this, right? As of now, what we will remember, this is the first point you have remembered. Second point is about acetaldehyde as an intermediate product. Third is, yate question ahe, the alcoholic fermentation is a ATP producing process, ne ATP consuming process. It is ATP consuming, karon yate plus loise no, NADH to ki produce koribo, ATP produce koribo, yate use korise. So ultimately ki hoy, ATP consuming process, no? ATP consuming. Second question, alcoholic fermentation hobo lagile kimanta ATP use hoise. Again we'll be reading about it. NADH2 ATP produce kore, FADH2 ATP produce kore. Kintu NADH2 eta molecule tinita ATP produce kore aru FADH2 eta molecule duta ATP produce kore. Keneke produce kore? As we go along in the chapter we'll learn about it. As of now, since NADH2 is used, we know ATP consume kori alcoholic fermentation hoise. Second part of the question, keita ATP consume hoise. Cleared? Ekhini points likhi diu bhalke. Alcoholic fermentation or 3 point janibo laibo. Also called as 3-PGL, phosphoglyceraldehyde. So এই তিনিটা point examination point of view পৰা important এইটোৰ ওপৰতো question আহে এইটো আৰু as far as this statement is concerned directly এইটো statementে উঠাই দিয়ে ঠিক আছে options থাকিব optionsত কি আহিব পাৰে যে triose phosphate is the electron acceptor নে electron donor acetaldehyde is the electron acceptor নে electron donor তাৰ আৰু একো লৰচৰ নহয় ঠিক আছে যদি এইটো question আহে এই statement থাকিবই তাৰ উপৰি অকমান চেঞ্জ কৰি দিব as far as the meaning is concerned as far as detailed description is concerned একো question নাহে যদি এইটো আহে তাহলে এইটোৱে আহিব ইয়াৰ ওপৰত actually কৈছে কি চোৱা alcoholic fermentation কথা কৈ আছে so starts from what obviously glucose কি হলে convert হয় pyruvic acid কি হলে convert হয় ethyl alcohol কিন্তু এটা intermediate product form কৰে acetaldehyde right during this process কি হয় reducing cofactors বিলাক use হয় right so ইয়াতেও আমি যেহেতু glycolysis কৰা নাই glycolysisত আমি কি কৰিছিলো যে glucose gets converted to pyruvic acid and what is produced আমি এতিয়ালৈকে ATP produce কৰি আছো it's only ATP out of the three products no ATP asile CO2 asile aru water asile ei gutei tintar bhitor okol ATP code produce kore this one kintu okol ATP buli kwa loge loge will come across certain words called as substrate level phosphorylation or direct right so via ATP production duta rastat hobo pare either directly hobo glucose or pyruvic acid convert hoise majate ATP produce hoise or ATP code produce hobo pare je ei process to a reaction to jetia choli ase tetia intermediate hisabe ki produce hoise NADH to bhangi pelai ki form korise ATP tamane glucose jetia pyruvic acid ole convert hoy okol ATP produce kore ATP keneke produce kore duta either directly আমি দেখা পাম গুটে 10 step reaction or দুটা মান stepত আমি ATP দেখা পাম আৰু কিছুমান stepত আমি ATP নেদেখি পেলাই NADH দেখা পাম যে NADH যদি ফৰ্ম কৰিছে আলটিমেটলি NADH টো ভাঙি পেলাই কি ফৰ্ম কৰিব ATP টো ফৰ্ম কৰিব বুজি পাইছা না নাই সো ATP production লগত দুটা word is either ATP production process টো আমি কি কৈছিলো phosphorylation right so substrate level phosphorylation substrate mane respiratory substrate glucose bhangile directly ATP form korise ami keneke kom paisu je reaction tut ami kisuman steps ot ATP dekha paisu jehetu ATP dekha paisu so we consider that is directly produced from the glucose so that is direct level phosphorylation ba substrate level phosphorylation in the 10 step process kisuman steps ot ATP nedekhi pelai NADH dekha pam কিছুমান স্টেপত NADH produce হৈছে হে যে NADH বোৰ produce হ'ব ultimately NADH বিলাক ভাঙি পেলাই to ATP এ ফৰ্ম কৰিব so either ATP directly form হৈছে নহলে via NADH form হৈছে are you understanding in the process of glycolysis glucose gets converted to pyruvic acid and within this process ATP gets synthesized ATP keneke produce হৈছে either directly or NADH ভাঙি পেলাই হৈছে right so yate ultimately ami dekha pam je a process to NADH form hoisile NADH to bhangi pelai ki form koribo ATP form koribo hetu process ami pisot pohim as of now acetaldehyde or upor question to ahise acetaldehyde electron acceptor ne electron donor so NADH ki hole convert hoise NAD ta mane yar proton electron to gusi goise na nai right so ultimately yar electron to e ahile right so ei karone we have written this statement যে acetaldehyde is the electron acceptor basic details of nacha by a point basic details of gole basic confuse hoba in alcoholic fermentation acetaldehyde or role ki electron acceptor as simple as that clear direct level substrate level via ETS eblak words ami pisot use korim hol so ekini hol tumar alcoholic fermentation or point ki important he tinta okay hol khai goso ekin likhila ne etu likhila jar hol lactic acid fermentation heading koriba So either we are talking about alcoholic fermentation or we are talking about lactic acid fermentation, that কি হয় ATP consume হয় বা ATP lost হয়, কিমান ATP 6 ATP, কারণ both the cases we have seen the use of 2 NADH, right. Next is the first point is the difference, carbon dioxide evolve হয় না নহয়, carbon dioxide evolve lactic acid or নহয়, alcoholic fermentation হয়, that is the distinguishing feature of alcoholic fermentation. যেহেতু দুটাই লাগে আৰু বেলেগ নালাগে, butyric acid fermentation নালাগে. So up till here what we have done is we have talked about fermentation. Fermentation কি মনে থাকিব যে fermentation is nothing but anaerobic respiration. ATP produce হয় নহয়, যেহেতু it's a part of respiration, so each and every step of respiration produces ATP, so fermentation will also produce ATP, right. Sorry, anaerobic respiration will also produce ATP, right. Next anaerobic হৈ গ'ল, fermentation or দুটা major point of difference কি carbon dioxide evolve হৈছে নে নাই, আৰু acetaldehyde first to পৰা question আহে electron acceptor, right. 5 minutes or এটা বস্তু লিখো, এখিনি হ'ল ন, এখিনি হোৱা নাই, এখিনি লিখি লোৱা. হ'ল ন নাই হোৱা লিখি লোৱা inorganic phosphate এইটো পাৰ্টত just to have an idea about the respiratory substrate. Respiratory substrate মানে কি যোনটো বস্তু breakdown হৈ পেলাই ATP produce কৰে তাক আমি কি বুলি কওঁ respiratory substrate. এটা cellত respiratory substrate যে অকল carbohydrates এ থাকিব not necessary. কিন্তু if we are talking about carbohydrate, what's the most common type of carbohydrate that's present is obviously glucose, right? And that is the reason why we have written common respiratory substrate কি হয় glucose, right? Apart from glucose বেলেগ বেলেগো থাকিব। এই reactions বিলাকত কি দেখাইছে যে গ্লুকোজ তো ভাঙি পেলাই কি হ'ব গ্লুকোজ যদি ৰেসপিৰেটৰি সাবস্ট্ৰেট হয় হিটো ভাঙি যাব লাগিব ভাঙি গৈ পেলাই আলটিমেটলি এটিপি প্ৰডিউস কৰিব লাগিব ঠিক তেনেকৈ if fat is the respiratory substrate that will also needs to get broken down and produce ATP so as far as these reactions are concerned you don't have to buy hard ঠিক আছে এটো জাস্ট দেখাইছে যে যদি সেলটোত স্টার্চ থাকে স্টার্চ টু যদি রেসপিরেটরি প্রোডাক্ট হয় বা সাবস্ট্রেট হয় তেতিয়াহলে স্টার্চটো ভাঙি যাব লাগিব সো স্টার্চ কি হলে ভাঙিছে গ্লুকোজ 1 ফসফেট গ্লুকোজ 1 ফসফেট কি হলে ভাঙিছে গ্লুকোজ 6 ফসফেট গ্লুকোজ 6 ফসফেট আলটিমেটলি ভাঙি ভাঙি কি ফর্ম করব পাইরুভিক অ্যাসিড কোড যাব ক্রেবস সাইকেল আলটিমেটলি টার্মিনাল অক্সিডেশন হ'ব আৰু গুটেই বিলাকে কি ফর্ম কৰিব এটিপি প্ৰডিউস কৰিব ক্লিয়ার সো এইখিনি মুখস্থ নকৰিবা এইখিনি মুখস্থ কৰিব নালাগে So if suppose starch is the respiratory substrate, this is the pathway that they follow. Ultimately ক'ত যাব, glycolysis হ'ব, Krebs cycle হ'ব, terminal oxidation হ'ব. Next, cell to fat থাকিব পাৰে as a respiratory substrate, তেতিয়াহ'লে oxygen কাক break কৰিব, fats ক break কৰিব. So fats gets broken down into what? হেতুহে দেখাম ইয়াতে, right? They can do anything. They can do anything. They can either convert to sucrose, they can either break down to produce carbon dioxide and water, or they can form intermediate products also, right? Ultimately, one common thing that we will notice is whatever might be the respiratory substrate, fats e hok, carbohydrates e hok, organic acid e hok, ultimately tahate sob breakdown kori pelai ki form koribo, carbon dioxide, water and ATP e form koribo, right? Protective respiratory substrate ultimately glycolysis or logot log lagibo ba Krebs cycle or logot lagilo, mutale complete oxidation hoi jabo. Right? Again, you don't have to remember out of this point, no, yate eta question ahise the fats gets oxidized into khali eta statement duta statement eta hol fats bhangile ki hoy, fats bhangile fatty acid aru glycerol produce kore, that is the one statement. Second, fatty acid bhangile ki hoy, fatty acid bhangile acetyl coenzyme A produce hoy. Out of the entire thing that we have written, just two statements. Fats gets oxidized into fatty acid and glycerol. What happens to fatty acid? Glycerol nizor pathway thakibo, fatty acid or nizor pathway thakibo. Kintu question point of view, fatty acid or ki hoy hetu hudise because acetyl coenzyme A obviously is the link between Krebs cycle, right? Organic acid that is respiratory substrate hoy, hebilak organic acid bhangi pelai ultimately ebilak bostu form koribo, right? আৰু এইবিলাকেও respectively আকৌ ভাঙি ভাঙি ATP produce কৰিব, right? Out of all this, oxaloacetic acid we have already discussed. At least we know something about oxaloacetic. Malic acid also we have talked about CAM cycle পঢ়োতে বা C4 cycle পঢ়োতে আমি malic acid পাইছো. Glycolic acid পাইছা নাই? Obviously পাইছো C2 cycle. C2 cycle of glycolic acid form কৰে তো কাৰণে cycle টোক আমি কি বুলি কৈছিলো? C2 cycle বা photo respiration কৈছিলো, right? So, এইবিলাক মুখস্থ নকৰিবা হা যোনখিনি টিক কৰিছো অকল সেইখিনি and finally sometimes proteins could also be the respiratory substrate proteins যদি respiratory substrate হয় তেতিয়াহ'লে কিহলৈকে ভাঙিব amino acids ultimately organic acid বিলাকো ভাঙি পেলাই কি ফৰ্ম কৰিব carbon dioxide and water. So what is respiratory substrate? The substrate that gets oxidized, right? And from where ATP or the tree products get synthesized is called as respiratory substrate. At a cell respiratory substrate could be of different types. The most common being carbohydrates. Amongst carbohydrates, which is the most common, obviously glucose. Right? I think this is all for today. We'll continue the class. The chapter in the next class. Thank you.